The land office clerk was locking the double doors with hands that shook so badly the key rattled twice against the plate before it caught. And Jenny Keating slowed her wagon in the middle of Broken Elm's only street, because something about the way Abner Prout kept glancing over his shoulder told her this was not a man closing up for the noon hour. 3 riders sat their horses in front of the office, and none of them had dismounted, which in Jenny's experience of frontier towns meant they did not intend to stay long enough to be polite. The lead rider wore a duster the color of old rust and a pistol worn low and forward on his hip in the manner of a man who had drawn it more than once for reasons other than snakes. He leaned down from the saddle and spoke to Prout in a voice pitched to carry. "Open it back up, Abner. We only need the one file, the Callaway claim. Won't take a minute of your day." "The office is closed for inventory," Prout said, and the tremor in it was not convincing. "Mr. Vane's business will keep till Monday." "Mr. Vane don't much care for waiting," the rider said, and that was when Jenny set her brake and climbed down from the wagon seat, because a woman who spent her life traveling alone between isolated homesteads learned early that the worst thing you could do in the face of trouble was pretend you had not seen it. She had her mending basket over one arm and a satchel of borrowed books over the other, and she must have looked harmless enough crossing the street, because none of the 3 riders paid her any mind till she was close enough to hear the second man mutter that they ought to just break the lock and be done with it. It was at that moment that a second set of boots came down off the boardwalk behind her, unhurried, deliberate, and a voice she had not heard in 7 years said, "Nobody is breaking any locks in this town while I am wearing this badge." Jenny turned, and there was Wesley Ramsey, taller than she remembered, the boy's softness long since burned out of his face by sun and duty, a star pinned crooked on a coat that had seen better winters. His eyes found her first, widened for just a heartbeat with something that might have been shock or might have been the particular ache of an old wound reopening, and then he set his jaw and looked back to the riders as though she were a stranger he had simply happened to pass. "Sheriff Ramsey," the lead rider said, and there was no respect in it, only the flat courtesy of a man reciting a title he did not believe in. "This does not concern you. Mr. Vane's business with the land office is a private matter." "Public records kept in a public building concern me plenty, Briggs," Wesley said. "You want a file, you put in a written request to Mr. Prout in the ordinary way, same as anybody else in the territory, and you wait for him to pull it during office hours. You do not sit a horse in front of a locked door and make an old man's hands shake." Cole Briggs's mouth curled. "Careful, Sheriff. Man who signs your salary voucher every quarter is the same man who sent me here." "Man who signs my salary voucher does not own my badge," Wesley said, and though his voice did not rise, something in it dropped low and hard enough that the horse under Briggs sidestepped as if it had felt the words before the rider had. "Now you and your 2 friends are going to walk your horses down to the livery and cool them off, and Mr. Prout is going to finish locking his own door in peace, and if Mr. Vane wants that file, he can ride in himself and ask like a citizen instead of sending 3 armed men to frighten a clerk." For a long moment nobody moved. Jenny's heart beat hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, and she was aware, distantly, of how exposed Wesley was standing there in the open street with only a badge and a steady voice between himself and 3 drawn tempers. She did not step back. She had never been the kind of woman who stepped back, and she was not about to start in front of him. Briggs looked at his 2 companions, some silent calculation passing between them, and then he straightened in the saddle and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow more insulting than a curse would have been. "You tell Prout we will be back with Mr. Vane himself then. And Sheriff, you might ask yourself how long a badge stays pinned to a man the council does not want wearing it." They wheeled their horses and rode off toward the edge of town at a walk that dared anyone to call it a retreat, and the street exhaled around them. Prout sagged against his own door frame, and Jenny was at his elbow in an instant, steadying him, while Wesley came up the boardwalk steps 2 at a time. "Abner, you are white as flour," Wesley said. Sit down before you fall down. They wanted the Callaway file, Prout said, his voice thin. The original homestead patent, the survey, all of it. Wesley, I have kept that office honest for 11 years, and I have never once had a man ride up armed to take a public record. You did not give it to them. I told them I would need to check with the Territorial Land Office in Yankton before releasing any file to a private party, which bought us time. But Wesley, they will be back, and next time Vane will be with them. And I do not know how long I can hold a locked door against a man who funds half this town. Wesley's jaw tightened, and it was then that his eyes came back to Jenny, really looked at her for the first time since he had spoken to Briggs, and something in his face softened even as the trouble in it deepened. Jenny Keating, he said quietly, as though testing whether the name still fit her the way it used to. I heard you had come back through on your circuit. I did not expect to find you standing in the middle of an argument on your first afternoon. I did not expect to find you wearing a star, Wesley Ramsey, she said, and there was more truth in that than she meant to let show. Last I heard you were breaking horses for your uncle out past the Grand River. A great deal changes in 7 years. So I am learning. Prout, recovering some of his color, looked between the two of them with the frank curiosity of a small-town clerk who had just realized there was a second story unfolding under his nose. But he had the good sense to say only, "Perhaps we ought to go inside, and I will show you both exactly what those men wanted." The land office smelled of dust and tallow candles and the particular dry sweetness of old paper. Prout led them to a locked cabinet in the back room and drew out a slim file tied with a ribbon gone brittle with age, and inside it were the original homestead papers for a parcel of land along the Mora River, filed a decade earlier under the name of Thomas Callaway. Thomas proved up on that claim in '81, Prout said, laying the papers flat on his desk. Built a cabin, dug a well, ran cattle on it for 5 years before he passed 2 winters back. His widow, Hattie Callaway, has worked that land alone ever since, her and one hired hand, and she has never missed a tax payment. But 3 weeks ago, Silas Vane filed a deed with the territorial recorder in Yankton claiming Thomas sold him the parcel outright back in '83, 2 years before he ever finished proving up, which does not even make sense under the law, but the deed is dated after the patent was issued, so on paper it could pass for legitimate if nobody looked closely. And nobody has looked closely, Wesley said. Nobody but me, and I am one clerk with no authority to overturn a filed deed, only to keep the original record safe until the circuit judge can rule on it. Judge Harmon Cole rides through in 5 weeks. Vane means to have that widow offer land, and his cattle watering at that river bend before the judge ever sets foot in Broken Elm. Jenny had gone very still, looking down at the old patent with its careful copperplate script, the surveyor's seal, the faded signature of a man she remembered only vaguely from her girlhood, Thomas Callaway, a quiet rancher who had once mended a wheel for her father's wagon without being asked. "I know Hattie Callaway," she said. "I stopped at her ranch on my circuit 2 years running before I ever left this territory. She used to trade me eggs for mending. If Silas Vane thinks he can forge a piece of paper and steal that woman's whole life out from under her, he has picked the wrong widow to try it on, and he has certainly picked the wrong seamstress to notice." Wesley looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, equal parts warning and something warmer he seemed determined to keep buried. "Jenny, this is not mending a hem. Vane has money enough to have bought half the council, myself included, whether I asked for it or not, and men like Briggs writing for him. This could turn dangerous fast. I have ridden this territory alone for 7 years, Wesley Ramsey, through blizzards and dry creek beds and one memorable encounter with a bull that did not care for my bonnet," she said. "I am not made of the same glass I was when you left." Something flickered across his face at that, quick and pained, and she wondered if he heard it the way she meant it, the small barb hidden inside the larger truth. He had not exactly left her so much as chosen his father's ranch debts, and the town's expectations over a girl with a wandering satchel and a stubborn heart. But the wound had healed crooked all the same, and she had carried the shape of it for a long time. "I never said you were made of glass," he said low. "I said it could turn dangerous. There is a difference." "Then it is a good thing," she said, softer now, "that I am not asking your permission to help Hattie Calloway. I am only telling you that I intend to." He held her gaze a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth turned up, just barely, the ghost of a smile she remembered from a boy who used to race her to the schoolhouse fence. "Then I suppose I had better ride out with you. So, you do not have to explain to Hattie why her seamstress showed up alone talking about forged deeds." They set out the next morning, while the frost still silvered the grass, the kind of morning peculiar to that turn of the season, when the days had begun to warm enough to soften the earth to mud, but the nights still bit hard enough to skin ice over the horse troughs. Jenny drove her own wagon, a sturdy thing outfitted with a false bottom for her books and a cedar chest for her sewing goods, and Wesley rode alongside on a big bay gelding. And for the first hour neither of them said much of anything, letting the creak of wheels and the rhythm of hooves fill the silence between two people who had once known each other better than anyone and now had 7 years of separate living to account for. "You never married," Wesley said finally, not quite a question. "I never found a reason to stop moving long enough," Jenny said. "There is always another family who needs their winter coats mended before the frost sets in for good, another child who has never seen a picture book, another widow woman who has not had a letter read to her in a year because her eyes have gone bad, and there is nobody else to do it. I like being needed in 100 small ways instead of one large one." "That sounds lonely." "It sounds free," she corrected, though she was not entirely certain some mornings that the two were not the same thing wearing different names. "And you? I heard talk in Pier that you took the badge 4 years back. The council came to me after old Sheriff Danvers took a fall from his horse and never recovered proper use of his arm. I did not seek it out, if that is what you are asking, but once I had it pinned on, I found I did not want to be the kind of man who let it be used for other men's purposes. And yet Vane funded your election. Vane funded half the town's improvements, the new schoolhouse roof, the church bell, my salary voucher same as Briggs said. That is the trouble with a place this size. There is one wealthy man and he touches everything, and a fellow can tell himself for a long while that accepting a man's money does not mean accepting his conscience, until the day comes he asks you to look the other way, and you have to decide all over again who you are. And which day was that? "Yesterday, in front of the land office," Wesley said, and there was something almost relieved in the admission, as though he had been waiting a long while to say it plainly to someone who would understand the weight of it. "I have been deciding it every day since, if I am honest." They came over a low rise an hour later, and below them the Calloway Ranch spread out along a wide bend of the Morrow River, a modest frame house with a stone chimney, a barn in good repair, and cattle grazing on new grass that had only just begun to green beneath the melting frost. A woman came out onto the porch at the sound of the wagon, wiping her hands on her apron, silver-haired and sturdy, with the particular squint of someone who had spent 30 years reading weather instead of newsprint. "Jenny Keating," Hattie Calloway called, her face breaking into real pleasure. "As I live and breathe, and with the sheriff besides. I hope this is a social call and not trouble, though the sheriff's face tells me otherwise." "A little of both, Mrs. Calloway," Jenny said, climbing down. "I have your winter coat in the wagon needing a new lining, and I am afraid we also need to talk about Sela's Vane." Hattie's face changed at the name, the pleasure draining into something older and more tired. "Come inside, then. If we are going to speak of that man, we might as well do it over coffee, because it is a conversation that has kept me from sleeping most nights this past month." Inside, the little house was neat and worn in the way of a home lived in fully rather than merely occupied, quilts folded at the foot of the bed visible through an open door, a shelf of well-thumbed books that Jenny recognized from her own lending circuit years before, A man's coat still hanging on a peg by the door, though its owner had been 2 years in the ground. "He came himself, 3 weeks back," Hattie said, pouring coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. "Silas Vane, sitting his horse right where yours is standing now, telling me he owned this land fair and square since '83 and I had best make my arrangements to move along before the circuit judge came through and made it official. I told him Thomas never sold a foot of this ground to any man, and he smiled at me like I was a child who had misplaced her doll, and he said the paper said otherwise, and paper does not lie." "Paper can be made to lie," Jenny said. "I have seen it done. I once caught a land agent in Nebraska trying to pass off a bill of sale written on paper that was not even milled until 3 years after the date it claimed. Do you have anything of Thomas's, Mrs. Calloway? Papers he might have kept private, a strong box, a hidden place he might have used." Hattie shook her head slowly. "He was not a secretive man, not with me. Though come to think of it, in his last winter he grew strange about that old coat there by the door, would not let me give it to the church poor box though it was worn through at the elbows, said he wanted it kept a while longer. I never thought much of it beyond an old man's sentiment." Jenny's eyes went to the coat, and something in her, the part of her that had spent 7 years running her fingers along seams and linings and hidden hems, went quiet and alert the way a hunting dog goes still at a scent. "Mrs. Calloway," she said carefully, "would you allow me to look that coat over? I mend for my living. Sometimes a man hides things where a wife would never think to search, not out of secrecy but because it is the last place he expects anyone to look." Hattie's face was uncertain, but grief and hope moved across it in equal measure, and she rose and took the coat down from its peg and laid it across the table like something sacred. Jenny's fingers moved over the wool with practiced patience, feeling for the telltale stiffness of paper hidden beneath fabric, the slight unevenness that gave away a seam that had been opened and resewn by hand rather than by the original tailor's machine. She found it at the lining of the left breast, a row of stitches slightly too small, slightly too careful, done by someone without a seamstress's trained hand but with a great deal of determination. "Here," she breathed, and Wesley leaned in close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her shoulder, and Hattie had gone entirely still, one hand pressed to her mouth. Jenny drew her small sewing scissors from her basket, and with the gentleness of a woman who had unpicked 1,000 hems, opened the stitches Thomas Calloway had sewn shut with his own clumsy, loving hands. Inside the lining, folded small and wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth to keep out the damp, was a sheaf of papers, and on top of them, in Thomas's own hand, a letter addressed simply to whoever should find this. Hattie read it aloud, her voice breaking more than once. Thomas had written it in the last month of his life, when the fever that would take him had already begun to steal his strength, and he had grown afraid. He wrote that Silas Vane's man Otis Fane, the county recorder over in the next township, had approached him twice offering money for the water rights along the river bend, and when Thomas refused both times, Fane had made a remark about how a man's signature could turn up on papers he never signed, and how hard that would be to prove otherwise once a man was dead and could not speak for himself. Thomas had hidden the original pat, the surveyor's field notes, and a signed statement witnessed by 2 people, in case such a wickedness ever came to pass. And there, at the bottom of the witness statement, in ink gone brown with age but still perfectly legible, were 2 names Jenny had not expected to see. Witnessed this 14th day of March, 1881 by Wesley Ramsey and Jenny Keating. "I remember this," Wesley said slowly, wonder creeping into his voice. "I was 16, Thomas asked me, and you to stand witness the day he filed his final proof, because we happened to be at the land office delivering your father's tax payment. I had forgotten entirely." "I had not," Jenny said quietly. "I remember you let me hold the pen steady because my hands were cold." She looked up at him, and for a moment the 7 years fell away entirely, and they were simply 2 young people who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of something larger than themselves without knowing it. Hattie Calloway was weeping openly now, clutching the letter to her chest. "He saved me," she said. "Even sick and afraid, he thought of me first. Oh, Thomas." "This is proof, Mrs. Calloway," Jenny said gently. "Real proof, dated years before Vane's forged deed, with living witnesses who can testify to the truth of it. We are going to take this to Judge Cole, and we are going to make Silas Vane answer for what he has done." It did not take long for word to reach Silas Vane that the widow's seamstress had found something in an old coat, because in a town the size of Broken Elm secrets moved faster than horses, and by the time Jenny and Wesley returned to town 2 days later to compare the recovered papers against the forged deed filed at the county recorder's office, Vane himself was waiting for them on the steps of the land office. A heavy-set man in a fine gray coat with the soft hands of someone who had not swung an axe in 20 years, though the coldness in his eyes suggested he had ordered plenty of men to swing them for him. "Sheriff Ramsey," Vane said pleasantly, as though they were meeting at church. "And Miss Keating, I understand. The traveling seamstress with such a talent for finding things that were never meant to be found." "Mr. Vane," Wesley said, his voice carefully even, "I understand you filed a deed on the Calloway parcel. We have some questions about its authenticity." "Its authenticity is a matter for the courts, not for a small-town sheriff and a woman who sews," Vane said, though the pleasantness had thinned considerably. "I would think carefully before you go stirring up trouble, Ramsey. The men on this council who put that star on your chest expect certain courtesies in return, and among them is the good sense not to make enemies of the men who built this town." "You mean the men whose cattle graze on land you have not always come by honestly," Jenny said, and Vane's eyes cut to her with real dislike for the first time. "You would do well, Miss Keating, to remember that a woman who travels alone through empty country is vulnerable in a great many ways a settled woman is not. Accidents happen on lonely roads, bridges wash out, horses spook." The threat sat in the air between them, thinly veiled as concern, and Jenny felt Wesley go rigid beside her, his hand drifting toward his hip though he did not draw. "Was that a threat against a citizen of this territory, Mr. Vane?" Wesley asked, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous. "It was a weather report," Vane said smoothly, already turning to go. "This is a treacherous season, Sheriff. Warm days, hard freezes at night. A great many things can go wrong for people who insist on traveling through it. Good day to you both." He walked away unhurried, and Prout, who had been listening from the doorway with his face gone pale again, said quietly, "He means it, Wesley. I have seen what happened to the Dietrich family out past Bear Creek when they refused to sell. Their whole herd turned up rebranded inside a month, and when they complained to the county, the ledger showed the cattle had always carried Vane's mark. Nobody could prove different. That night Jenny could not sleep in the little room Prout's wife had made up for her at the boarding house, and near midnight she heard the soft crunch of gravel outside her window and found Wesley standing below in the moonlight, hat in hand, looking up like a boy uncertain whether he was welcome. "I could not sleep either," he said, when she leaned out the window. "I keep thinking about Dietrich's cattle. Vane has been altering brands for longer than we knew, and if he did it to Dietrich, he has likely done it to half a dozen small outfits along that river, and nobody has put the pieces together because nobody travels between those ranches enough to compare notes. Nobody except a traveling seamstress who visits every remote homestead on her circuit twice a year," Jenny said, understanding immediately where his thoughts had gone. "I did not want to ask it of you, not after what Vane said today." "You did not ask it, I am offering it." She came down to the porch in her shawl, and they sat together on the steps in the cold, their breath showing in small clouds, closer than strangers, careful as old friends relearning a language they had once spoken fluently. "Tell me something, Wesley. That day years ago when you chose to stay and I chose to go, did you ever regret it?" He was quiet a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "Every day for the first year. My father was drowning in debt from the drought, and the ranch would have gone to the bank within the season if I had not stayed to work it off. And you had your own father's grief to carry after your mother passed, and neither of us had a single thing to offer the other but more hardship. I told myself I was being sensible. I have wondered ever since if I was only being afraid. Afraid of what? Of loving someone enough that losing them would break something in me I could not fix again. It seemed safer to lose you a little, on my own terms, than to risk losing you a great deal, on terms I could not control. He looked at her then, and the moonlight caught the honesty in his face, stripped of the badge and the duty, and all the careful distance he had kept since she rode into town. I do not know that it was the right choice, Jenny. I only know I have thought of you on more nights than I would care to admit to a living soul. I thought of you too, she admitted, the words costing her something to say plainly after so many years of not saying them at all. Every homestead I visited, every family I sat with by their fire, I would catch myself wondering what it might have been to have a fire of my own to come home to, and a man waiting at it who knew me before I ever became this version of myself. They did not touch that night, not yet, but something settled between them on that cold porch step, an understanding that the years had not erased what had been there so much as buried it, and now the ground had begun, very carefully, to thaw. The plan they settled on was simple in shape though dangerous in execution. Jenny would continue her circuit as though nothing had changed, visiting the ranches along the river where Vane's men had been most active, and under cover of delivering mending and library books, she would ask quiet questions about brands and cattle counts, and any strange visitors who had come through offering to buy water rights. Wesley would ride the official patrol routes but watch, at night, for any sign of rustling in progress, since a man caught with a running iron in his hand was harder to talk his way out of than a man who merely filed suspicious paperwork. It was on the 9th night of this arrangement that Wesley, riding the low bluffs above the Dietrich place in the cold dark with only a sliver of moon to see by, spotted 3 shapes moving cattle away from the herd in a wide loop meant to avoid the ranch house, and recognized among them the particular rust-colored duster of Cole Briggs. He should have ridden for help. He knew that even as he turned his horse down the bluff at a controlled walk, keeping to the shadow of the cottonwoods along the creek. But there was no help within 2 hours' ride, and by morning the cattle would be scattered across 3 counties with new brands burned into their hides, and the Dietrich family would have no more proof of theft than Hattie Calloway had once had of ownership. He was perhaps 50 yards from the herd when a shout went up, one of the riders having spotted his silhouette against the pale line of the horizon, and then everything happened very fast. A gun fired, wide, more warning than aim, and his horse shied hard enough that he nearly lost his seat, and he drew his own pistol and fired once into the air, shouting for them to stand down in the name of the law, which earned him nothing but a second shot that came close enough to part the air by his ear. What he had not expected, what made his heart stop cold in his chest, was the second set of hoofbeats coming up hard behind him, and Jenny's wagon horse, unhitched and ridden bareback in her night clothes with her shawl flying, crashing through the brush with a lantern held high in one hand, shouting at the top of her voice that she could see every one of their faces and would swear to it before Judge Cole himself. "Get back, Jenny, get down," Wesley shouted, furious with fear for her even as some helpless corner of him marveled at the sight of her. The rustlers, faced now with a lantern that threw their faces into clear light, and 2 witnesses shouting their descriptions across the dark, broke and ran rather than risk a hanging charge added to the theft, abandoning the herd they had already cut out and spurring their horses hard toward the river crossing. Briggs, the last to go, wheeled his horse once more and flung something to the ground before he fled, a curved iron rod that rang against a stone as it fell, a running iron, the tool used to alter a burned brand into a different shape entirely. Wesley swung down and retrieved it with hands that were not quite steady, whether from the fight or from the sight of Jenny sliding off her borrowed horse with her lantern still burning bright as a small defiant sun. "You could have been killed," he said, and it came out harsher than he meant it to, fear wearing the mask of anger the way it so often did. "So could you," she shot back, "riding down alone on 3 armed men with no one to watch your back. I was not about to sit in my bed and listen to gunfire and wonder if you were dying somewhere in the dark, Wesley Ramsey. That is exactly why I did not want you involved in this. And that is exactly why I involved myself anyway," she said. And then, because the fear was still coursing hot through both of them and had nowhere else to go, she closed the distance between them and kissed him, hard and sudden and entirely without permission from either of their better judgments. And he made a low sound in his throat and kissed her back, as though he had been waiting 7 years for exactly this moment in exactly this cold, dark field. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing unsteadily, he pressed his forehead to hers and said, "I am going to spend every day worrying about you now, you understand. That is what this means." "Good," she said. "I intend to spend every day worrying about you too. It seems only fair." They brought the running iron and their sworn testimony to Wesley's office the next morning, and word of the failed rustling spread through Broken Elm within a day, and with it came a strange new courage among the smaller ranchers who had quietly suffered similar losses and said nothing for fear of Vane's reach. The Dietrich family came forward. So did 2 other outfits along the river, the Ostergaards and Old Man Kellerman, each with their own story of cattle that had wandered off strangely and returned, when they returned at all, wearing a brand slightly different from the one burned onto them at birth. But if Wesley had hoped this groundswell of testimony would shame the town council into backing him, he was quickly disappointed. Mayor Vance Whitlock called him into a closed meeting 3 days later, and the banker Elias Thorne was there as well, both men looking at him with the particular discomfort of people who had come to deliver bad news they had convinced themselves was reasonable. "Silas Vane has offered to underwrite the new courthouse roof," Whitlock said without preamble. "Provided certain investigations into his business affairs are allowed to run their natural, unhurried course through the proper channels, rather than being pursued with quite so much enthusiasm by this office." "You are asking me to slow down a fraud investigation in exchange for roofing materials," Wesley said flatly. "I'm asking you to remember who put you in that chair, Wesley," Thorne said. "This council can as easily take the badge back as it gave it. There is an election in the fall, and a man who has made an enemy of the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties is not a man easily re-elected, whatever the merits of his cause." "Then perhaps I will not be re-elected," Wesley said, standing. "But I will not spend the months I have left with this badge looking the other way, while an old man's dying wish gets trampled, and a widow loses the only home she has left in this world. If that costs me the chair, gentlemen, I find I can live with the price." He left the meeting with his jaw set and his future uncertain, and it was that same evening, walking back toward the boarding house to tell Jenny what had passed, that he found Cole Briggs waiting for him in the alley beside the Mercantile, alone this time, no witnesses, no lantern light to catch his face. "You made a mistake, Sheriff, siding with that woman against Mr. Vane," Briggs said, low and ugly. "She goes out on that circuit alone, day after day, all through empty country nobody watches. Accidents happen to lone travelers. I would think on that if I were a man who cared what happened to her." Wesley's hand found his pistol grip before conscious thought caught up to it. "If one hair on her head is harmed, Briggs, I will not wait for a judge or a jury. I will come for you myself, and you can tell Vane I said so plainly." Briggs only smiled, unpleasant and unafraid, and melted back into the dark, and Wesley stood alone in the alley with his heart pounding, understanding with sudden, sick clarity that he had just made things infinitely more dangerous for the one person in the world he could not bear to lose. He found Jenny packing her wagon for the next leg of her circuit, humming softly to herself in the lamplight of the boarding house yard, and the sight of her, safe and unaware, nearly undid the resolve he had spent the walk over building. "Jenny," he said, and something in his voice made her turn immediately, sensing trouble the way she always seemed to. "What has happened?" "Briggs threatened you tonight. Directly, plainly, no pretending it was weather talk this time." He raked a hand through his hair, pacing the small yard. "I want you to stay in town. Do not ride the circuit again until this is settled. Stay somewhere I can watch over you. I have a dozen families waiting on mending and letters between here and the Grand River, Wesley. I cannot simply abandon my whole living because a man like Briggs likes to make threats. This is not the same as an ordinary risk of the road, Jenny. This is a man telling me to my face that he means you harm, and I cannot do my work chasing Vane's fraud and also ride beside your wagon every hour of every day to keep you safe. Then do not ride beside me. I never asked you to. I have kept myself alive on this circuit for 7 years without a sheriff's escort, and I will not start hiding in a boarding house now, not when Hattie Calloway and the Dietrichs and the Oster Guards need every scrap of evidence I can gather from the families further out. And if something happens to you out there and I am here, unable to reach you in time, how am I supposed to live with that, Jenny?" His voice cracked on her name, raw in a way she had not heard from him even in the dark field with bullets flying. "I already lost you once because I let duty and fear make my choices for me. I will not lose you a second time because I was too proud to simply ask you to be careful." "You are not asking me to be careful," she said, quieter now but no less firm. "You are asking me to stop being who I am. I cannot do that, Wesley, not even for you. Especially not for you, because if I did, I do not think I would recognize the woman you say you love." The word love hung between them, unclaimed by either of them fully, and for a long, terrible moment neither spoke. "Then perhaps," Wesley said finally, his voice gone flat with a pain he was clearly trying to master, "it would be safer for both of us if you finished this leg of your circuit and did not come back through Broken Elm until the judge has ruled, and this business with Vane is settled one way or another. I cannot watch you ride into danger I invited, Jenny. I would rather have you safe and angry with me somewhere far away than have you close and in Briggs's reach." It was not what either of them wanted, and both of them knew it even as the words left him. But pride and fear are old companions to love in every age, and neither Jenny nor Wesley was immune to their persuasion. She climbed onto her wagon seat without another word, her chin lifted in the particular way he remembered from every argument of their youth, and drove out of Broken Elm into the gathering dark, leaving him standing alone in the yard with his heart in ruins and no earthly idea how to call the words back. The circuit took her north and west along the river, through country that grew wilder and more thinly settled with every mile, and Jenny threw herself into the work with the fierce concentration of a woman determined not to think too closely about the argument she had left behind. She mended coats and delivered borrowed novels and read aloud letters from sons who had gone off to the railroad camps, and at nearly every stop, when she gently steered the conversation toward cattle brands and strange visitors, she found more threads of the same dark pattern. At the Ostergaard place, old Nils showed her a ledger page he had copied from the county recorder's book before it mysteriously went missing, numbers that did not match his own tally book by 11 head. At the Kellerman Ranch, the widow's grown son admitted quietly that a man named Otis Fane had come through twice offering cash money for the family's water frontage, and had grown short-tempered when refused. And at a small homestead run by a Dakota family named Iron Cloud, whose allotment bordered the very bend of River Vane coveted most, an elder named Walks Alone told her through his granddaughter's careful translation that Vane's men had already tried twice to move a fence line under cover of darkness, encroaching a little further onto land that had been theirs long before any Homestead Act ever drew borders across it at all. Land taken and retaken and threatened, yet again, by the same hunger for water and grazing that now stalked the widow Calloway. "Tell him," Jenny said to the granddaughter, moved by a grief and an anger that went beyond her own trouble. "Tell him I will put his family's account into my letter to the judge as well." Every voice added makes the lie harder to hide behind. By the time she turned her wagon back toward Broken Elm 3 weeks later, she carried in her cedar chest not only Thomas Calloway's hidden papers, but a growing testimony of theft and encroachment stretching the length of the river. Enough, she believed, to make even a corrupt council take notice. Because a scandal large enough threatens every man's comfort, not only the sheriff's badge. She thought of Wesley every mile of the way back, turning his words over and over, understanding now, with the clarifying distance of 3 weeks alone under open sky, that his insistence on sending her away had not been the same cowardice that once kept him tied to his father's ranch. It had been fear, yes, but fear born of love rather than a lack of it, the particular terror of a man who had already buried a mother, watched a father worked into an early grave by debt, and could not bear the thought of burying the one woman who made his solitary duty feel like something worth carrying. She did not forgive him the words so much as she came, slowly, to understand them, and understanding, she found, made room for a forgiveness she had not thought she was ready to offer. Wesley, for his part, spent those same 3 weeks in a town that had grown steadily colder toward him. The council had not yet stripped his badge, but Whitlock made a point of avoiding his eye at the mercantile, and Thorne's bank had suddenly discovered irregularities in the sheriff's office's quarterly allowance that would need to be reviewed before the next payment could be released. Vane himself had taken to riding through town at leisurely hours, tipping his hat to Wesley with the serene confidence of a man who believed the outcome already settled in his favor. It was a letter from Hattie Calloway, delivered by a passing drover, that finally cracked the careful composure Wesley had been holding together by sheer stubbornness. She wrote to say that Otis Fane had ridden out to her ranch personally, informing her that the circuit judge's docket had been quietly rearranged, and her hearing moved up by nearly 2 weeks, giving her far less time to gather her defense, and that she feared, without Jenny's testimony and the corroborating accounts from the other ranches, she would stand alone before the judge with nothing but a dead man's letter and no living witness present to speak to its truth. Wesley read the letter twice, then saddled his horse before the ink of his own hurried reply had even dried, because he understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Vane meant to force the hearing forward specifically to catch Jenny still out on her circuit, unreachable, unable to return in time, and that his own foolish insistence on sending her away might now cost Hattie Calloway everything, and might cost him Jenny besides. If harm found her on the road while he sat safely in town nursing his wounded pride, he rode north along the river road that same afternoon, following the route he knew her circuit took, driven by a fear sharper than any he had felt facing down Briggs and his gun. The trouble was the weather. It was that treacherous turn of the season when a morning could dawn mild enough to melt the last snow off the north-facing slopes, and by afternoon, the runoff would swell every creek and gully for 50 miles, and the temporary footbridge that spanned the narrows above Calloway Bend, a structure of rope and hewn planking that the ranchers themselves maintained each spring, had never been built to hold against a true flood surge. Jenny reached that crossing at nearly the same hour Wesley crested the bluff a mile downstream, and neither of them yet knew the other was so close. The river had risen alarmingly since she had crossed it heading north 3 weeks before, brown and furious with snowmelt, carrying broken branches and slabs of river ice down from the higher country, and the footbridge groaned audibly under the current's pressure as she led her wagon horse out onto the first planks, testing her weight carefully before committing the wagon itself. She should have turned back. She knew it even as she made the choice not to, because turning back meant a 2-day detour around by the ford at Miller's Crossing, and Hattie Calloway's hearing had been moved forward, and every hour mattered now. She led the horse and wagon out onto the bridge a plank at a time, murmuring low reassurances to the animal, and she was perhaps two-thirds of the way across when she heard, beneath the roar of the water, a sound like a rifle shot, which was in fact the sound of the upstream anchor post giving way under the strain. The bridge lurched sideways. The wagon horse screamed and reared, and Jenny was thrown hard against the rope railing, which held only long enough for her to grab it before a second post failed, and the whole structure began to fold downstream, plank by plank peeling away into the flood like pages torn from a book. Wesley heard the horses scream from a half-mile off and put his spurs to his bay gelding without a second's hesitation, riding harder than he had ever ridden in his life, his heart a single hammering word: her name, her name, her name. He crested the last rise above the crossing in time to see the wagon itself tear loose and vanish downstream in a spray of white water, and Jenny clinging to a single remaining section of rope railing, her feet braced against a plank that was even now splintering beneath her, the current tearing at her skirts, dragging her steadily toward the broken edge where the bridge simply ended in churning brown water. "Jenny!" he shouted, already flinging himself from the saddle, unlashing the coil of rope he carried at his pommel for exactly this kind of country, though he had never in his life imagined using it for this. "Wesley!" Her voice came thin and desperate over the water's roar, and the sight of her face, white with cold and terror but still fighting, still holding on with everything she had, broke something open in his chest even as it steeled his hands into perfect, deadly calm. He worked fast, looping the rope around the trunk of a cottonwood at the bank, testing the knot with brutal thoroughness because a knot that failed now would kill them both, and then he went out onto the collapsing structure himself, plank by treacherous plank, the rope paying out behind him, the icy water clawing at his boots where the bridge dipped low enough to let the current wash over it. "Do not let go," he shouted, though she had given him no reason to think she would. "I am nearly to you." Another section of decking tore free just behind him with a crack like a gunshot, and for one heart-stopping instant he thought the whole bridge would take him with it. But the section under his feet held, barely, and he closed the last few yards on his hands and knees, reaching her just as the plank she stood on split clean in two. He caught her wrist as she fell, his own body anchored by the rope lashed around his waist and looped back to the cottonwood, and for a moment they hung there together, half in the freezing water, the current dragging at both of them with terrible patience, and Jenny's satchel, the one carrying Hattie's papers and every testimony she had gathered along her circuit, slipped from her shoulder and began to sink. She grabbed for it instinctively, and Wesley felt her weight shift dangerously in his grip. "Leave it," he shouted. "Jenny, leave it, I have got you. Do not let go of me for a piece of paper." "It is Hattie's whole life," she gasped, water in her mouth, her fingers just brushing the satchel's strap. "So are you mine," he shouted back, raw and furious with love and terror in equal measure. "And I am not letting this river have you, not for Hattie Calloway, not for Sela's Vane, not for anyone, do you hear me? Hold on to me." Something in his voice reached her past the cold and the panic, and she let the satchel go, watching it vanish beneath the brown water even as she wrapped both arms around Wesley's neck and let him haul them both, hand over hand along the rope, back toward the solid bank, the cottonwood groaning under the strain, the last of the bridge tearing itself apart behind them in a final crash of splintering wood. They collapsed together on the muddy bank, soaked through and shivering, alive, and for a long moment neither of them could speak at all, only cling to each other while the river roared on, indifferent, past the place where it had so nearly taken everything from them both. "I am sorry," Wesley said finally into her wet hair, his voice breaking. "I am sorry I sent you away. I have never been so afraid in my whole life as I was riding toward that bridge, thinking I might be too late." "You were not too late," she whispered, her hands fisted in his soaked coat as though she still did not quite believe he was real and solid and here. "You are never too late, Wesley Ramsey. That is the thing I understood out there on that circuit, riding away from you angry. You have never once been too late for me, not 7 years ago and not today." He drew back just far enough to look at her, at the mud on her cheek and the fierce, exhausted love in her eyes, and he kissed her then, slowly this time without the desperate haste of the cattle field, a kiss that tasted of river water and relief and 7 years of longing finally allowed to speak plainly. "I lost the satchel," she said against his mouth, a small broken laugh escaping her. "All of it, Hattie's papers, everything I gathered on the circuit, gone down river." "We will find another way," Wesley said, and meant it with his whole battered heart. "We survived that river together. We can survive a courtroom without a satchel of paper. But Jenny, I need you to hear me say this plainly, because I do not intend to spend one more day pretending otherwise. I love you. I loved you at 16 holding a pen steady for your cold hands, and I loved you every year you were gone, and I love you now, soaked to the bone on a muddy riverbank. More than I have ever loved anything in this life, including that badge, including my own pride. Whatever comes of Vane and the hearing and this whole tangled business, I want you beside me for the rest of it. Not on your circuit alone, not in town alone, but beside me, if you will have me." Jenny's eyes filled and she pressed her forehead to his, both of them still shaking with cold and the aftermath of terror. "I will have you, Wesley Ramsey. I have wanted to have you for 7 years, if I am honest, and I was only too proud and too frightened to say it plainly myself. I love you. I have loved you the whole time I was pretending to have moved on." They built a small fire from driftwood, while their clothes dried enough to make the ride back to Broken Elm bearable. And it was there, wrapped together in Wesley's spare blanket against the last cold breath of that uncertain season, that the careful distance they had kept even in their reunited affection finally dissolved into something unguarded and tender, his hands learning the shape of her face by firelight, her fingers tracing the old scar above his eyebrow that she did not remember from their youth, and made him tell her the story of, both of them laughing softly between kisses at how foolish they had been to waste even a single one of the 7 years apart, when this warmth, this rightness, had been waiting for them all along. But the satchel was gone, and the hearing had been moved forward, and by the time they rode into Broken Elm together the following afternoon, road-worn and wind-burned but unmistakably no longer strangers to each other, they had only 2 days left before Hattie Calloway would have to stand before Judge Harmon Cole with nothing but Thomas Calloway's original hidden papers, which Wesley had thankfully left in the safe keeping of Abner Pruitt's locked cabinet rather than carrying them on the circuit himself. "The witness statement is safe," Wesley reminded her that evening, as they sat with Pruitt and Hattie in the land office going over what remained to them. "That is the heart of the case, the dated proof that contradicts Vane's forged deed. We have lost the corroborating testimony from the other ranches, but we still have the original document, and we still have our own memory of witnessing it as young people." "It may not be enough," Pruitt admitted worriedly. "Vane will have Fane, and perhaps a paid witness, or 2 of his own ready to swear the forged deed is genuine. Without the Dietrichs and the Ostergaards and the others here in person to speak to the pattern of his fraud, the judge may see nothing but one widow's word against a wealthy man's paper. Then we ride out tonight and bring them ourselves," Jenny said immediately. "There is still time, barely, if we go now and return by first light of the hearing." It was Wesley who shook his head, though not out of fear this time, but calculation. "If we both ride, Vane's men will know exactly what we are doing, and could intercept us on the road as easily as they went for that bridge. Better if I stay here and keep watch over Hattie and the original papers, and you go, since you know the families and the fastest routes between their ranches, and Vane's men, having already tried once to stop you on the water, may not expect you to move again so soon or so boldly." "You are trusting me to ride out alone into danger again," Jenny said, searching his face for the fear she had seen there before their reconciliation. "I am trusting you," he said simply, "because you are the most capable person I have ever known, and because loving you does not mean caging you, Jenny. It means standing at your back while you do what only you can do, and trusting you to come home to me when it is finished. That is the lesson that river taught me. I cannot protect you by keeping you small. I can only love you by believing in you fully and being here waiting when you return." She kissed him once, hard and grateful, and rode out within the hour. And by dawn she had gathered Nils Ostergaard, the Kellerman widow's son, and the Dietrich patriarch himself, all of them willing now to ride into Broken Elm and speak their piece before the whole town if it meant an end to Vane's reach over their herds and their lives. The hearing convened in the largest room Broken Elm possessed. The church itself pressed into service as a courtroom, and Judge Harmon Cole, a lean, silver-whiskered man with tired, shrewd eyes, took his seat behind a table borrowed from the schoolhouse while half the town crowded onto the pews to watch. Silas Vane arrived with Otis Fane at his side, and Cole Briggs standing near the door with two other hired men, and the sight of them sent a ripple of tension through the gathered crowd. But Wesley had stationed himself at the front near Hattie Calloway, and he had, quietly, asked several of the town's other ranchers to come armed but seated, a silent show of readiness that Vane could not fail to notice. The forged deed was presented first, Fane testifying smoothly to its authenticity, claiming he himself had notarized the original transaction back in '83. It was Jenny who rose when Wesley gave her the nod and walked to the front of the church with the original patent and Thomas Calloway's witness statement in hand. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "I would ask the court to examine the paper itself before considering the testimony attached to it." She laid both documents before the judge. The paper Mr. Fane claims was used for a transaction in 1883 carries a mill mark on its reverse side that I recognize from my years traveling this territory as a seamstress and courier of goods, a mark used by the Dakota Paper Company, which did not begin operating until 1885. I would ask the court's clerk to examine both documents' paper stock and confirm this discrepancy, which any stationer or printer in Yankton could verify under oath. A murmur ran through the church. Judge Cole examined the papers himself, holding them to the window light, his brow furrowing. "She is correct," he said after a long moment. "This mark is unmistakable. Mr. Fane, would you care to explain how a deed dated 1883 came to be written on paper not manufactured until 2 years later?" Fane's composure cracked visibly, and into that crack Wesley stepped, calling forward Nils Ostergaard, the Kellerman widow's son, and Dietrich, each of whom testified in turn to altered brands, missing cattle and Vane's repeated pressure to sell water rights along the river, painting a pattern too consistent and too widespread for any reasonable judge to dismiss as coincidence. It was Briggs, watching his employer's careful fiction collapse in real time before the whole town, who made the final desperate move, drawing his pistol near the church door and shouting for everyone to stay back while he and Vane made for their horses. But Wesley had anticipated exactly this, and the armed ranchers seated quietly through the hearing rose as one, rifles and pistols leveled, and Briggs found himself facing not one lawman but a dozen furious neighbors who had finally had enough of losing their herds to a man's greed. "Put it down, Cole," Wesley said, his own pistol drawn and steady, stepping between Briggs and the door. "It is finished. Running now only proves every word these men have said about you and your employer both." Briggs's eyes flicked around the church, saw no path through the leveled guns, and slowly, with a curse, lowered his own weapon and let it fall to the floor. Vane, for his part, had not even reached for a gun, standing frozen and gray-faced as Judge Cole rose from his makeshift bench and declared, in a voice that carried to every corner of the crowded church, that the deed filed by Silas Vane was hereby ruled a forgery, that the Calloway parcel remained the lawful property of Hattie Calloway, and that the matter of fraud, theft, and the falsification of county records would be referred to the territorial marshal for full criminal prosecution against both Vane and Otis Fane. The church erupted into a noise that was not quite cheering and not quite disbelief, something warmer and more communal than either, neighbors reaching to grip Hattie's hands, the Dietrichs and Ostergaards embracing each other with the particular relief of people who had feared ruin and found, instead, vindication. Hattie Calloway wept openly, gripping Jenny's hands in both of hers. "You saved my whole life," she said. "You and that old worn coat and a boy's memory of a signature witnessed on a cold morning years ago. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You already have, Mrs. Calloway," Jenny said, smiling through her own tears. "You taught me, all those years ago, trading eggs for mending, that this territory takes care of its own when it is given half a chance. I only helped it along a little." The territorial marshal arrived within the week to take Vane and Fane into custody, and Briggs offered leniency in exchange for full testimony against his employer, confirmed everything the ranchers had suspected: the altered brands, the bribed county clerk, the deliberate sabotage of the footbridge meant to delay Jenny's return before the hearing. The town council, faced with the scandal and the very public unraveling of the men who had funded so much of Broken Elm's recent prosperity, quietly abandoned their pressure on Wesley altogether, and in the fall election that followed, he ran unopposed, the town having finally seen, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what kind of sheriff they had in him. The winter that followed was a mild one, as if the territory itself had exhausted its temper along with Sela's vain schemes, and by the time the first true green came up along the Mora River the following spring, Jenny Keating had traded her wandering satchel for a small shop on Broken Elm's Main Street, a proper seamstress's establishment with a lending shelf of books along one wall for any family passing through who wanted news of the wider world, because she had found, in the end, that she did not need to give up the wandering part of herself entirely, only to plant it somewhere it could grow roots alongside a home. Wesley Ramsey continued to wear his badge, though it sat differently on him now, no longer weighted by other men's debts of gratitude, funded honestly by a council that had learned, the hard way, the cost of looking away from wrongdoing for the sake of comfort. He and Jenny were married that same spring in the little church that had so recently served as a makeshift courtroom, with Hattie Calloway standing as witness in a dress Jenny had sewn herself, and the whole town turning out with a warmth that felt, to both of them, like the truest kind of homecoming. They built their life together in the rooms above the shop, close enough to the jailhouse that Jenny could bring him coffee at midday, close enough to the river that on warm evenings they walked its bank together, no longer haunted by the memory of that collapsing bridge, but grateful for it in the strange way people grow grateful for the worst nights of their lives once they have survived them and found love waiting on the other side. There were no children in those first years, only the two of them, learning each other anew, building trust one ordinary day at a time, his hand finding hers across the supper table, her fingers tracing idle patterns against his palm while he read the newspaper aloud, the particular passionate tenderness of two people who had once lost each other to fear and pride and had chosen, deliberately and completely, not to make that mistake again. Hattie Calloway kept her ranch, her cattle grazing undisturbed along the river bend that had so nearly been stolen from her, and she never once forgot to bring a basket of eggs into town for the seamstress who had once been a girl with a wandering satchel and had become, in the truest sense, family. And on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the lamp burned low in the little apartment above the shop, Wesley Ramsey would look at his wife bent over some new piece of mending or a borrowed book she meant to pass along to the next family who needed it, and he would think, with a certainty that had taken him 7 hard years and one collapsing bridge to earn, that he had never in his life felt so entirely, so completely home.